starting point is that the legislation's gone through the parliament today, and it's part of a package of reforms to digital platforms that were recommended by our competition regulator. So the ACCC's job is to regulate bad market practice, right? What they found was that Google and Facebook weren't tech companies, they were advertising companies, and they were a monopoly power in Australia. And he's recommended a number of reforms: privacy reform, obligations on disinformation, a review on ad tech, which no one understands, that secret trading room that's going on behind every website, and the media bargaining code. And the bargaining code was to say, in law, public interest journalism has a value, and you, Google and Facebook, have, because you have monopoly power in advertising, and that's had an impact that is against the public interest, need to go and come up with a fair price for journalism on your networks. And they don't like that. They don't like being, regulated. So there's been a long process. It's been working its way through the various houses. In January, Facebook threatened to shut search if the laws went through. Obviously, a week ago, last Thursday, Facebook just hit the button and stopped not just news, but any site that had media releases on it, really. And a lot of public interest sites. And for both those companies, I think they were they're desperate to ensure the laws don't apply to them. So then the political leverage that's now been going on has been, well, if you do the deals with the media company, we're still going to pass the law, but there's what's called a designation on top of that. So you've got the law that says there's a way of valuing news. There's the designation that determines who's in, and then there's the commercial negotiations on top of that. So it's a leverage piece to force monopolists to do things they don't want to do, which is to negotiate with media companies. Right. So Google's approach has been that they're living the fiction that the code doesn't apply to them, and they've set up what they're calling Google News Showcase, which I think is a bit of a fig leaf to make it look like they're doing a deal for Showcase, where they're really just doing a deal to keep out of the code. And then Facebook, I think, will end up probably going down the same path. What's really interesting was when Facebook hit the button last week and shut all the sites in Australia, one of the first world leaders that our Prime Minister called was your Prime Minister, because they're aware of how desperate Facebook is to make, we're tiny, you're huge. Right. So, it's interesting, isn't it? That, so I don't know what your Prime Minister did with that. But I do know that from where I sit, Facebook's walked it back a little bit. They said yesterday they were going to restore news, but there's been some amendments, but they don't seem to me to be particularly material to the way the code's going to operate. Because going back, the code is a leverage point to force the negotiation. What the amendment says is before the code is activated, there'll be a mediation process. So it's almost a procedural amendment more than anything else. So I think they stuffed up last week and went too hard, and there'd been a bit of a backlash.
Just for the more uninformed reader, if you could maybe go into the broader features of the media bargaining code in general, and in a more granular perspective, the implications that it has, not just for Facebook, but also for public interest journalism as well.
Okay. So this is the way I describe it. So what our regulator found was that Google and Facebook are advertising monopolies in Australia. They account for over 80% of all advertising goes through those two platforms. Now, what he said is that traditionally the way we've valued news is based on how many ads the media proprietor can sell. So if you pull the advertising out of that because now you've got a monopoly player that doesn't do news, then what is news worth? We know the cost of not having news because we see it happening around the world where Facebook is your only form of information. You've seen it, in Burma, you've seen it in, South America, you've seen it in the United States, right? Where they can't even agree on the outcome of an election. Right. So how do you actually create a market in fact-based journalism? And he said, well, you guys go and work it out. And if you can't work it out, what you're going to do is the media company and the platform put your most reasonable offer on the table, and an independent arbiter will determine which one of those is the most reasonable. So it's called final best offer.
Right.
Now, the power of that in a way is never having to use it, but it does force parties towards agreement rather than pulling them apart. So what does it mean for public interest journalism? It means that it's going to be more than nothing. It means there is a value in journalism. It appears to me in Australia with a population of 23 million, the final price the platforms will pay will be around 200 million. So if you took that logic into India, it will be a whole lot more.
Facebook has come to the table pending some kind of amendments or modifications to the code, right? So are there any changes, and how significant are those changes compared to what you just described?
The changes are in process. So it's just what will happen before the arbitration is triggered.
Okay.
So I think the amendments say that if agreement isn't reached, the government will inform Facebook or Google before they start the arbitration process, and they'll have 30 days, and they will consider whether they've made reasonable steps to come up with an offer. So it's just building a bigger process, which obviously fits the interests of the monopolists because they can then lawyer up and slow, but there is a time limit on it. And I guess the other thing is that at this stage, neither Google or Facebook has been named in the code. So, but the whole purpose of the code is leverage to do a deal to value public interest journalism, and that's still occurring, right? So I don't think it's fundamentally changed the integrity of the code, which is where I draw the conclusion that Facebook backed down.